Well, another huge family conversation in marriage and family. And last time we kind of left off of strategic leadership and family and parents to kids and such. And this is kind of a part two, a continued conversation of some of those ideas and other other additions to it. And I guess to kind of start it off, you had given us a lot of good things to kind of think about from last time, Mom. And a question, I guess, to kind of pose initially would be if you were to start fresh today, what core values would you choose as the foundation of a family, and how would you actually turn those values into a clear family vision?
So I've been thinking about this a lot because I think, um, you get to a point in your life where you reflect back on not necessarily the fruits of your labor, but I wouldn't necessarily say regrets, but man, I wish someone had kind of helped me through, mentioned that a couple times, just, guided me a little bit on how important this work is that we do. And so, um, for me, it's faith in God. I want to say something about that, so don't let me forget.
Yeah,
And then, truth telling. I think being honest, teaching your kids how to be honest in all their dealings. And that's something that also kind of surprises me that people aren't emphasizing. Um, Integrity, work ethic, loyalty, and service. And I think some of those really stand out for you that I think I was mindful of, like service, loyalty. Those are all things that you could probably look back in your childhood and feel like those come up a lot. Um, Faith in God for sure. But now in this, right, confusion, this kind of drift that we live in, what exactly does faith in God look like? And so I think it's important for parents to name, which is kind of different than when I was raising kids. Like you guys, I believe if I was mentoring all of you, I would name very specifically what you're trying to do as parents.
mm,
I don't know that that's something previous generations had to do. I think it's kind of a new thing, honestly, which sounds weird because society just had it built in. Of course, you didn't steal something from the store. Now you turn on the television and people are looting and stealing and justifying it. Well, like in our government right now going on, a lot of people aren't getting their welfare benefits. And so they feel justified going into a store and stealing.
right.
So just that confusion, it's interesting. And so I think for parents to name some of these core values that they're looking at, and those are the ones I would focus on. Um, when I was saying truth telling, there's a really great talk that Dallin H. Oaks gives about moral relativism. And I think like he warns us about it. And this is obviously now he's our prophet, but at the time he was an apostle. And I think it was very prophetic because now we live in a time which is moral relativism, which I think correlates to this drift, this emotional and ideological drift that we live in. Like whatever feels good, maybe.
Yeah,
Well, you know, what's your truth? That's something we hear a lot. And so I think to name these values that you and your spouse want to live within would be very beneficial. And I don't know that I had to do that as much at the time that I raised my kids, but now I think it would be very valuable because otherwise you assume people are on the same page, right? So that's part of the strategic idea is we're sitting down and this is, I think, understood between us, but maybe let's say it and see if it's true. And then let's discuss what that might look like, even though I don't necessarily have kids old enough to fit into this system yet, but
yeah,
I'm going to. So, not assuming that you just, everyone knows the same thing. You and your wife both agree bedtime is 7 p.m. versus midnight, right? And so, because you might have different ideas on what some of these values, and that's not a value. I just mean there's things like that that
Right.
are going to come up that are similar. I think I mentioned in one of it, like dad and I had very different ideas of what curfew looks
Right.
like. And I wouldn't have known until we butted up against that. We thought different. And that's okay. But I think as those little hiccups, those bumps come up, those little mismatches, you name it, right?
And
Like this falls into integrity. This falls into telling. This falls into a faith issue. Sorry, go ahead.
no, yeah, no. And I guess to kind of come back to, you said moral relativism, and I guess to just kind of be more specific about that, what you're referring to is morals being circumstantial. They're not concrete. They're more fluid based on kind of what I'm experiencing as an individual. My morals can vary and shift as opposed to it being, no, these are just blanket morals that are important to everybody and we need to just live by them because everybody's better because of it. That's kind of what you're referring to, correct?
Right. And there's a family theory I kind of talked about that is interpretive. It's an interpretivism kind of family lens. And what that means is literally it depends. Well, so this family has this problem, and we can see that this child has this drug addiction. And is that bad or is it a big deal? Because, if there's a big conflict in the family, then the parents fall apart, or they've got a sick child who's got cancer. And so, you know, where do we look at kind of fine tuning an issue? Well, it depends. Are we going to agree that this drug addiction is a problem? Are we going to agree that the parents need to take a responsibility? Are I don't know, right? And so there's this kind of interpretivism that's happening in the world that falls into this relative. What's relative? It just depends on where you live, right? Are some of these issues, for example, is racism an issue? Where I live, it's not a big issue because most of the people are the same.
Right.
If you live in a different place, it's a big issue. And so,
Yeah.
right. And so then we would say in the world that we live in, is racism a problem? It could be, but maybe it doesn't affect me where I'm at. And so that's similar to moral relativism. Certain places that you live, it's a big problem, right? And it's starting to kind of filter into the world we live in with a lot of cultures changing geographic locations. That brings in a different value system. So I think it matters a lot for parents now starting out because you're going to have kids go to where I lived in Northern California. A lot of the kids had parents, grandparents, significant caregivers in prison.
Hmm.
And then they had a caretaker they lived with. And the reason they ended up in that situation was the state of California had decided they wanted kids close to their parents to be able to visit. And so, for example, I had a friend who he was from Georgia. His dad ended up in a federal prison in California. And so his grandma moved to Susanville
Hmm.
so she could raise the kids close. So he ended up having a cousin who came because then his uncle also got transferred into that prison. And so, very different upbringing, very different mindset of what things were like. And so, those are things your kids are going to confront, right? More than you did, more than I did too. So, I just think it's really good to start naming how you want your family to look. And as I would do that, I'm going to come back to two scriptures that I think are really important. And one is in Helaman 5:12, because foundation matters so much, where it says, right? And now remember my son, or now, and now my sons, remember that upon the rock of our Redeemer, who is Christ, the Son of God, that you must build your foundation. That when the devil shall send forth his mighty winds, his shafts in the whirlwind. Yea, when all his hail and his mighty and storm shall be upon you, it shall have no power to drag you down to the gulf of misery and endless woe, because the rock upon which ye are built, which is a sure foundation, a foundation where men can build and they cannot fail. And that's really ultimately the goal, right? And so when I said earlier, we sometimes want to detach the purpose of what we're doing. And and in my mind, it always was present, but I wanted my children to be prepared to meet God and to be prepared to do the work that had been prepared for them before they came. And so parents need to get really intentional because the devil is literally what we're dealing with. And it's always been the case, but man, he's in your face like crazy right now, right? And so um in that vein, it's come to Doctrine and Covenants 88, section 88, verse 119, where it says, organize yourself, prepare every needful thing, establish a house, even a house of prayer, a house of fasting, a house of faith, a house of learning, a house of glory, a house of order, a house of God. And so that is the strategic leadership model. God has one. Do we? And ours should align with his, in my belief. And so that becomes a requirement for parents to be really kind of fine tuning their own communication with the Lord in preparation for his children. And this is that in my mind, right? So that it's clear, your values are teachable, it gives you a standard when things go wrong. When you have big hiccups that happen in life, you've got something to fall back onto, into, because there's scaffolding already in place for your home and your family.
Yeah. What?
So go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that often I think a lot of, well, uh, kind of tying back some of the thoughts that you've already addressed, but I often have a lot of, or I see a lot of people asking the question, well, why is honesty important? Why is integrity important? Because truthfully, as you pointed out earlier, circumstances are difficult for people in the economic times that we live in, and sometimes it might seem like being honest, being integrous, um, not stealing, those types of things would be worthwhile. And that's just one, those are just kind of a few examples. But I think it all kind of comes back to, in some part, the drift that we have, to your point, from being a God-fearing people, right? And if we don't fear God, then morals don't really matter because I mean I think most people that I see making those types of excuses for bad behavior are because they don't have a foundation or grounds for their beliefs in the first place, right? Honesty is no longer important because I don't believe in God. I don't have to fear that someday I'm going to be punished, and maybe I'm going to get caught if I break one of the laws of the lands, but maybe I won't, and so it's not really that valuable. Where, if you're a God-fearing person, it's nope, it's all going to be taken into account someday. You need to be living a correct moral life aligned with these principles, as you've kind of mentioned. And I think that's at least something I've seen amongst my generation is that, and it probably, I mean, it started with yours and probably beyond that, of just people not believing in God, and maybe it's just because it's too rigid, but I, from everything that I've seen, is that the more structure and scaffolding, as you kind of mentioned, the rigidity in a lot of senses is actually the I guess what build that healthy environment culture. The moral relativism is no longer impactful for me because I'm living in a world that actually is a good world, and with people that value the same things, and everything is actually better because everyone thinks the same way instead of everyone thinking differently and uniquely from one another. And maybe there's probably better words to use for it, but then nobody gets along and nobody sees things the same way, and nobody can come to agreement with people in their life. And so I think, yeah, that's to kind of just add my thoughts to it. I think that's great in identifying those values, and as you said, naming them, I can see why there's a lot of value in that, and then adding the this is important because whatever those reasons might be. So
Right. Well, and I mean, to just one small point, we're trying to keep things simple, right? We're trying to keep what you're doing as parents really manageable because you could name 50 things that you want to teach your kids. And okay, it just you might not have time for that. And so back to your point, the question becomes, why do I live a principled life? Why do I have values? And I think something to reflect on is it's always been the case until the last couple generations that everyone agreed. And now we're starting to see the consequences of people not agreeing to some of those things, like being honest. And that is really selfish because then it has impact on me. And so if you want to live your life a certain way, that's fine. Then go be in a place or a community where everyone just takes everything. And there are cultures like that. There's this, culture in Africa. I'm not sure, so I don't want to speak too strongly to it, but they literally have kind of a mindset where you can just go take your neighbor's lawnmower. And there's a lot of community um, ownership to things. And so we don't live like that. Right. And so you would say to your child, all right, so we have integrity. We take care of the things we have, which means then someone can't just come take it. And we all agree in a neighborhood we're going to live among each other and cooperate and get along and not just be thinking of ourselves. And so again, that's why it comes back to these values. You're trying to get kind of concise and intentional. And if everyone has a mindset that they are accountable to something bigger than them, which now has become the government instead of the God, right? Which is problematic because the government's not really great at doing anything. And so, to your point, you live in a place where you're like, okay, God is ultimately, I'm convicted in my heart and my mind if I'm not in alignment with Him. And so, I want to do everything I can, even though I don't think He's going to send a lightning bolt out of the sky,
sure.
right? But eventually, you're going to know that you didn't do the things that you knew to be true. And so I don't think my belief is, we're going to convict ourselves more than anything. God's not going to have to. And you experienced that as a child, like where, right, you lied and then you're like, I don't know what to do. This is going to be right. You can't find peace. And
Right.
so that's kind of what we're trying to build for our children. So there's this idea that there's like intention, purpose, structure, vision, striving, I would say, right? We're striving in families, and that involves work. In addition, we're looking to teach our children things like repair. So when you have a house, if things break, you repair it and you improve it and you might even change it. And relationships and parenting is the same. So if you get in a fight with your wife, you don't just apologize. You have to repair the relationship and then you have to improve. And it's the same thing as you look at parenting. All right, I'm going to have this kids, and I'm going to do things, and I have to have a value system based on principles that we all align to. And then when any of us steps out of place outside of the structure of that, then we have repair, improvement, change, reconciliation, repentance, forgiveness, all those
Yeah.
things, right? And those are God principles. I don't know that people realize, even when they don't believe in God, that they still align to those values. And so, in my mind, and I've asked people, why do you believe then that someone owes you an apology if you don't have a value system that includes God? Because they live in a culture that has a value system that believes in God,
Right. Yeah.
right? And they just don't understand how deep. Jordan Peterson talks about this in Maps of Meaning. They don't understand how deep their culture goes or their value system or their belief system, right? The layers and layers and layers that a society is built on. And that's kind of what you're trying to, your tiny little pinhole of a slice of life is trying to teach your child as effectively as you can with the least amount of damage, because you're going to do it. Right.
Right.
So, so the other thing with Doctrine and Covenants that I just wanted to emphasize was, the house of order is the intention of building a family. This is what you're building. So be really intentional about what you're building, because you can't just start throwing up walls. You gotta have some floor plans.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
get, and this was kind of a good, I guess, transition into the next thing, which we're already getting short on time, and not to rush us by any means, but we've established kind of the values, some of the principles are kind of the overarching themes, but as we or identifying those are kind of the easy part, but then comes kind of the more tricky, which you're getting at is, I guess, what kinds of routines or rhythms kind of create the most stability and connection that help support these types of values, that help implement these types of values, or what would maybe have um, would you have done or do differently, or whatever you want, however you want to say that, so that these types of values could be more, I guess, emphasized in a family system.
Transmissible. Right.
Yeah.
So I would say if my children and grandchildren could take away any concept about how I believe parenting should kind of be, like the lens, it's predictability. I think children thrive when there's predictability, and that goes along with order. So when you can predict your environment, you can succeed the best possible way. However, life is going to throw at you unpredictable things. But if you don't pay attention, right, you're always scanning for predictable. You go to work the same way every day. What if the road shut down? Well, that throws a little chaos into your life. And then what you do from that point forward is scan for predictability. You don't even know. And so that's why it's so important for kids, right? So predictability becomes a form of love, because your kids know what they're going to get, and they don't have to wonder if they're safe, right? If they're alone, and who's in charge. So you really want to make sure you hit those three things. They're safe, they know they're safe, that they're not alone, and that their family is being led by parents who really care. So under the first heading, right, we have this idea of values and principles, and the values and principles emphasize those things. And then kids are always scanning, just like you are. You're always scanning for unpredictability. And so things that I think are really great, Sundays, right? If you're going to church, that's something that's part of your routine. And you can have like a little Sunday reset. We used to really emphasize family home evening. The church doesn't emphasize that as much anymore. So figure that out. In fact, you're figure out times that you're gonna, plan your week. We talked about this a lot. And you're gonna instruct your children, and you're going to coordinate events and activities and all those things. And then regular meal times as much as you can. Kids are gonna get busy. That's something I am not sure how I could have done different, um, because I think kids should be involved in things, but I don't know that those things in today's world are more important than spending time together as a family, honestly. Um, I I think that's something each parent leadership is gonna have to figure out. And so I think regular times are really great. I think basic household jobs that keep predictability, right? Like we had zones, we had chores, we had things that everyone contributed. Um, those are ways that create connection and stability in a home. And then simple spiritual rhythms. So there's a little bit of scripture study, like don't overwhelm them, don't make it too dramatic of a production in the home, right? We have maybe a scripture we're memorizing, especially for littles. You read some books that are scripture, and then that creates this rhythm, this cadence in the home. Um, one thing I really wish I had done more intentionally was weekly or evening check-ins, like daily check-ins. I tried to always meet you guys at the door, be the first one after school, right, that picked you guys up or whatever. And so I just wish I had had a little more foresight to check in a little, and then correlating that with your dad. So he had maybe one or two he picked up in a week, maybe Monday, Wednesday, something, right? There was just a little more intention behind. His dads and moms bring very different grounding energies. And so I, I just, I would do that different a little bit, maybe just more mindfully with my kids. And I think parents should really think about that. It's easy when they're little because you get from them. But as they get older, the relationship dynamic changes, especially when they're teenagers and when there's not a lot of foundation already in place, the kids will go away from you. And so you have to go find them. Or you preempt that by having things that naturally have them engage. Right? So what if parents and children don't have something that they match on? How do you relate to that child? That foundation can be set when they're really young. And I think parents should do that.
because the alternative is,
Disconnection,
yeah.
chaos, unpredictability, loss.
And that
So
that kid's going to go, like, as you said, that kid's going somewhere. But
you're
if
going to
they're
find
not
someone.
coming to mom and dad, they're probably going to, well, in this day and age, they're probably going to the internet. They're probably not, I mean, back when you were, you know, a teenager, it was probably go to your friend's house or go to the mall or go somewhere else, go find social interaction, which is actually a lot better than than what we have today. Now it's just,
Well, and now, I mean, some quick and easy things you can do is emphasize getting a job, right?
yeah,
Like them having some weight that they have to hold in their life, whether they need a job or not financially. It's good for 'em. That's what sports kind of add, right? Or
yeah,
dance, whatever. That's kind of the weight that those things add for sure. But technology makes it very different now.
yeah,
And so they're gonna go down. That's why my personal belief is I wouldn't give kids a phone. But or I'd make it so that's, like obviously you have to be able to get a hold of your kid. Fine. They don't have to have ownership of it.
right.
So, and I understand all of the limitations. I understand that it's social, it's cultural, it's all sorts of things. It has taken our children and they are captive now, just like
Yeah.
it's captivated us.
So I guess,
I
I
would,
mean, there's a lot more to this that we can, I think there's a lot more breakdown we still need to do. But I don't want to. I think let's just plan on doing another one, kind of
okay.
in line with these current kind of ideas and thoughts. But I guess any closing thoughts, any last kind of things to kind of wrap up values, rhythms, systems, kind of the what are kind of some last things,
Mhm.
or I guess even some things and encouragements to start thinking about for myself, for anyone who listens to this. What are some things we could take from what we've talked about today and then apply outside of whatever your last thoughts are.
Well, I've got three more points in this, but I'm just gonna co we're just gonna hang those up for a second. But I'd start just with this conversation, you know, looking at yourself and your relationship as husband and wife for the clear non-negotiables you want to have in a family. And then try to find ways to simplify that into kind of a mission statement or something that you can get clear. I mentioned in the last conversation we had about a scripture that I had. And so, right, those are things that you can do as parents to start naming, making things explicit out there so that kids can see it. A thing that was popular when I was raising kids was people would put over the door, return with honor, right? Another thing I'd say often is, we follow the prophet. And so those are too simple nowadays. That's too simple. You need something a little, it's got more hooks in it. So um, I would start thinking about that and then start noticing like, okay, if we could make a perfect day, assuming we understand how our kids might go, like right now, even today, right? Like in a perfect day, how would we implement these values into our life? And then the kids integrate. Parents shouldn't make a big structural change what after the child is born, because that's a huge structural change. But once the child comes, the rhythms and routine should get kind of locked in. And then you make small adjustments, right? Whether that's daily, weekly, monthly, yearly. And that's what I think should happen. Parents should talk every day. I think they should have some intentional time that they discuss every week. Families should meet every week together, whether that's Sundays, whatever, plan the life, have some instruction. Monthly, parents should have a time where they talk to each child monthly. And then there's yearly kind of goal setting, all of that. Like we did these, the parenting breakthrough book that I'll get to someday, had like we had a plan for you every year, things you're going to learn, things you were going to accomplish. And so that's kind of how I would integrate a lot of these things. Like, you know, we're seeing that our family's having an issue with integrity. Let's create some opportunities on the next 2 months for that to happen. Right. And so those are ways parents can really keep keep their ship going in the right direction with the right coordinates, not get too off course. And that's kind of how we got to think about it, whether that's a house, whether that's, a vehicle, something that moves. It can be all of those ideas of imagery, but you gotta keep things aligned. And to me, that's towards God. And so that's my final thought is just what are the things that are non-negotiables in your life that you want your kids to come away from your home knowing, not wondering about. And then they're not as influenced by the storms that are going to come at them, right? That we talked about in Helaman. Like Satan's got some things he's going to throw out. Life is going to just have some of those built in too, and we want them secure. Like kids going off to college nowadays, they get lost. They're just in the drift because the parents, sometimes, often the parents haven't been real intentional.
Yeah.
And so that's what I hope, I guess I'm just kind of hoping to encourage a sense of urgency to kind of just get your ideas as a parent group on online, get it online.
Yeah.
So then you're not just like, oh, we're not ready for this.
No, that's
No,
great.
you are. You're
Yeah.
ready, right? And you're praying about it and it's written down and you've got goals for it and it's there.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. And I think, of course, as you kind of suggested, getting more granular with all of these things, I think is going to be of great benefit as well. Because and keeping it in bite-sized chunks, I think is helpful. Let's establish this, and now let's get even more specific, and then continue in each of those different areas. So that's great
Thanks.
to be continued. To be
Okay.
continued.
Thanks, bud.